So one, you have like, church attendance kind of declines over the course of many years. You have polarization going up at the same time. So people are kind of like getting more intense in their worldly views, less intense in their spiritual views. And then there's this other thing, which is the rise of determinism in the public sphere. So it sort of comes from the scientific community first, that like neuroscience can explain a lot of our actions more so than this old, more religious concept of free will. And I am very nervous about neuroscience and determinism rising in the public square, in the legal system, in the way we think about why people make their actions. Free choice, all that stuff is going to completely change if our society gets more or less religious and we are losing faith in the idea that we make our own choices. Is that something that you studied in your background in religious studies? Because I don't know much about where that comes from in terms of theology. What is your take on that?
I think theologically, you see that in the Christian experience, and that there's a really big idea placed on free will and the notion that you have willingly aligned yourself with God, whereas there are other variants of the Christian experience that everything is predetermined because God is so imposing and so omnipotent that everything is according to plan, and thus you really have no free will. You're just sort of, I guess it's just an attitudinal shift to wherever you're predestined to go. In terms of the societal impact of that, that strikes me, I am less worried about that, because I think that the average person, if they were to get mugged and the mugger was like, sorry, I can't control my actions, you really have no moral obligation to like people would still try and lock the guy up. And from my end, I don't know. I have no idea whether, like, I mean, from my perspective, yeah, we're basically a bucket of organs and electricity, and it might very well be that that's all mechanical and that free will is an illusion. It might be that.
Well,
I don't know.
you talked to George Will, in his book,
The Conservative Mindset.
Yes.
Yeah, So in his book, he talked a lot about like the progressive era and sort of them wanting to approach humankind as moldable. Whereas the conservative sort of views the human condition as set, and you need to set government sort of parameters around it accordingly. But the progressive views that people can be changed. And so if you go back to the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan by Jonathan Hinckley Jr., this was an instance where we saw a very mainstream defense case for the insanity plea. And his defense lawyers get him a CAT scan, and they bring that into the courtroom, and they show that to the judge, and they're like, look, his brain is malformed, it's a little bit shrunken, he might be schizophrenic, and so we can do the insanity plea. The judge did not like it, but the jury did, and he ended up getting that insanity plea bargain, and he ended up being ruled not guilty as a result. And over the past 2 decades, we have seen a steady rise of people making that argument in courtrooms, and you have to wonder, there are going to be policy implications across our justice system, across how we think about who succeeds in life and who doesn't, equality versus equity, based on, do people have free choice? Just because somebody grows up in a poor neighborhood, are they determined to that outcome, or will they be able to make choices that lift them out of it? Like, that's going to completely remodel our society if we're not careful.
Well, I think there's a point, like, you can say, at least from a justice perspective, I think you could then begin to separate people into categories of, is this person dangerous versus is this person deserving of punishment? On my end, I'm really not interested in a punitive justice system. I'm interested in a justice system that's primarily rehabilitative and protects the public from dangerous actors. So in the case of John Hinckley Jr., I don't think anybody was debating whether or not he should be a free man on the street. It was whether he should be in a medical facility or a penal facility. And in that capacity, I think we've had way too much emphasis on this old religious model of you have sinned and must be a penitent, and therefore we're going to put you in a penitentiary, from which that word is derived. So I'm fine with it going the other way. I don't think it's super likely that we would just say, you are not morally responsible for this crime, therefore we're going to let you go. Another one that disturbs me, and I don't know quite what to do with it, is one of the first big public mass shootings in the country was I think it was at Texas A&M, I want to say, in maybe the 80s or 90s. And the shooter that got up on a clock tower and started picking people off like he'd killed his mother and his wife, and he'd left this note that was like, I love my mother. I love my wife. I don't know why I'm doing this. I think there's something wrong with my brain.
Yeah.
It's like, please look into this. And they did. And it turned out he had this big tumor pressing up against him, and that there appears to have been some kind of serious neurological impediment that was preempting him.
Yeah,
to do these things.
there has been shown multiple times that people become murderers, pedophiles, when tumors form in their brains that are not known to them.
Yeah.
And their behavior completely changes. And but the problem is when we start getting too sure of ourselves and our ability to predict what people are going to do. If we lose faith in the idea that people make choices on their own and that we are going to then go by those consequences, like, I get what you're talking about, Andrew, with like, you know, a punitive justice system versus one that tries to understand and grapple with the science. But we're eventually going to start looking at people inside their brains at the earliest age and then make judgments about what they're going to do. And then make judgments about whether or not they need to maybe live their entire lives in isolation because they're going to be dangerous. And you know that's going to happen, or at least I do, because I'm kind of a sci-fi guy.
So you're thinking Minority Report, like we will
little
eventually have
bit.
this kind of,
a little
or
bit.
kind of like maybe like Gattaca or something, where there's this scientific way of assessing your status or your danger level and that kind of thing. That'd be. I mean, I think regardless of which direction we want to go, the two worldviews that you just described a moment ago, Stephen, of a moldable human being versus a fairly stable human being that we mold the government around. I'm definitely in the latter category. But at the same time, I guess people of that kind of Burkean worldview, as opposed to that Rousseau worldview, are very frequently wrong in what we construe human nature to be. You can go back a couple hundred years where there's this long period of time where we think that there's far more difference between men and women, and women can't possibly hold office because they don't have the capacity to do that. Very wrong in that capacity. So we have to be able to sort of amend these things as we go. I think from either direction, there's going to have to be tweaking.
And I think that kind of goes back to like the whole, conversation about religion and faith and stuff like that. I think we have too much faith sometimes that government's going to get it right all the time, or that even science will get it right all the time. Maybe that's kind of where we have to put a little faith in like God or just something else. And it's a little bit healthier, or even if we don't have to put that faith there, it's more healthy when it's placed there as opposed to like, oh, let government like figure out everyone's predestination, because, like you're saying, science and public opinion, we're changing stuff all the time that way. So like, I guess that's one of those places where we have to maybe draw it back a little bit from that faith oddly enough, in institutions. I generally like building up institutions, but maybe we put it in a different institution. This also kind of goes back to, what's his name? The scholar had a great book on like the failure of institutions, like why they're failing and stuff. Do you see like the failure of like people to become religious and get involved in organized religion? Like, do you think that's part of our institutions just kind of like failing a little bit?
Yes, I think it's a component. I don't think it's the underlying component. So
Okay.
I suspect you're talking about Yuval Levine.
Yes,
and,
thank you.
It's I interviewed him on the Political Earth. I'm a big fan, and I very much agree with that kind of Tim Carney, Yuval Levine, Robert Putnam idea of declining social capital and declining social trust. I think that that's a really big thing. I think religion is a effect of something deeper underlying, which is just there are atrophied communities, which to me is the big thing, and atrophied institutions in the American experience, and or I should say in the Western experience, but just particularly in America, I think people are becoming far more atomized, and I think that this is something to like kind of shake my fist at the libertarians that libertarians have become too reductive on, where the libertarian fight is the individual is paramount and the collective is onerous and bad.
Yeah.
And I'd say I agree with the libertarians when it comes to making decisions about your life. You should choose who you marry. You should choose what kind of job you have. But meaning in life doesn't come from the individual. Meaning in life comes from the group. It comes from being part of something bigger than yourself. And in America, we've really fetishized this individualism to the point where we think meaning comes from being an individual, and it does not. And that's making us very disconnected, very alienated. You combine that with all sorts of other things. I'd say chief among them probably just being how awesome and convenient television is. And people stay home and they don't go to church or to the Elks Lodge or to their school board or whatever. And all of those things atrophy those intermediate civil institutions, as Yuval Levine might say, one of which is religion.